Welcome back. We are reading the exciting tale of the fairy tale detectives, not detectors, of the Sisters Grimm. We are in chapter 2, and this is part 2. This is the second half of the chapter. Let's talk about what's going on. So Daphne and Sabrina, sisters, we know that. They don't know where their parents are. Basically, they're orphans. They're living with their grandma, but Sabrina does not believe that she's her grandma. Some weird stuff is going on. There were some pixies that were really mean to them. They don't know what's going on. There's some weird stuff going on, but right now what's happening in the chapter is they're going to the store, and Mr. Canis got them crazy outfits or whatever, but they're going to the store with Mrs. Grimm, their grandma, their Oma. So let's find out what happens next. Here we go. The sisters stood by the door, waiting for the old woman to collect her things. Mrs. Grimm rushed around the house, grabbing books off of shelves and from underneath the couch, creating a tornado of dust that followed her from room to room. When she had collected as many as she could, she handed them to Sabrina. "Almost ready," she sang as she rushed up the stairs. Sabrina looked down at the top book. It was entitled Fables and Folklore, the Complete Handbook. Before she could question the book's purpose, she heard the old woman pull out her keys and unlock the mysterious door upstairs. "She's going into the secret room," Sabrina whispered to her sister. Daphne's eyes widened, and she bit the palm of her hand. For some reason, Daphne did this whenever she was overly excited, and though it embarrassed Sabrina, she let it pass. If she tried to curb all of Daphne's odd little quirks, she would never get any sleep. "I wonder what's in there," Daphne whispered back. "That's probably where she keeps the bodies of all the other kids that she's stolen from the orphanage." Daphne stuck out her tongue and gave her sister a raspberry. Sabrina had to admit she was curious about the room. Whenever she was told she couldn't do something, Sabrina found it was all she could think about doing. But the great thing about rules was that you could break them and drive adults crazy. "Do you hear that?" Daphne asked. "Yeah, she's talking to someone," Sabrina replied. "Probably Mr. Canis." Sabrina strained to hear the conversation, but before she could make out anything, she heard Mrs. Grimm leave the room, lock the door, and head back downstairs. "Ladies, we're off," she said as she ushered them outside and went to work locking the front door. Then she knocked on the door 3 times as she had the day before, but this time she said, "We'll be back." "Who are you talking to?" Sabrina asked. "The house," Mrs. Grimm replied, as if it was perfectly a natural thing to do. Daphne knocked on the door as well. "Goodbye, dollhouse," she said, causing her sister to sigh and roll her eyes. As they turned to go to the car, Sabrina looked up and nearly stumbled. Mr. Canis wasn't upstairs. He was standing on the path with Elvis at his side. He returned his stare with a look of slight contempt. His gaze unnerved the girl, but no more than the realization that Mrs. Grimm had been talking to herself in that secret room. "We're ready, Mr. Canis," Mrs. Grimm said, and he nodded. They all climbed in the squeaky car, including Elvis, who laid his huge body across the girls' laps. "Did you have a chat with our neighbor?" Mrs. Grimm asked Mr. Canis as they all buckled or tied themselves in. "We began the old conversation," the old man grumbled, "but he can be stubborn." "Well, he'll get used to it eventually, I suppose," Mrs. Grimm replied. "He doesn't have a history of getting used to things," Mr. Canis said. Mrs. Grimm sighed and nodded. "What are you talking about?" Daphne said. "Oh, just a neighbor, nothing to worry about. You'll meet him soon enough." Sabrina looked around. She was sure they were miles from the nearest neighbor. Mr. Canis fired up the engine, and the car rocked back and forth violently like a bucking bronco trying to get rid of a cowboy, calming down as they drove out the driveway and through the desolate back roads. It means there's nothing there. Sabrina re-examined Ferryport Landing, the world's most boring town. There was a little obvious life, except an old dairy cow standing on the side of the road. Mrs. Grimm leaned over and honked and then waved wildly at the cow as they passed. When Daphne giggled about it, the old woman smiled and told her how important it was to be friendly. Meanwhile, Sabrina made the best of the trip by memorizing street names and calculating how long it would take to walk to the train station. They came to a mailbox with the name Appleby marked on it, and Mr. Canis turned the car down a long leaf-covered driveway lined with ancient cedars, pines, and oaks. Those are types of trees. The car passed a tractor sitting alone on a little hill and pulled over into a clearing where a massive pile of wood and pipes and glass sat, surrounded by yellow emergency tape. Mrs. Grimm looked at Mr. Canis and smiled. "Well, we haven't had to deal with something like this in a while, have we, Mr. Canis?" she asked. The old man shook his head and helped her out of the car. Once she got on her feet, Mrs. Grimm opened the back door, reached in, and scratched Elvis behind the ears. "Girls, do you mind if I borrow my boyfriend for a moment?" she asked as she winked at Daphne. Now, remember, that's a dog. The Great Dane crawled clumsily out of the car and stretched, and it's not really her boyfriend, it's a joke, and looked up at the old woman for instructions. She fumbled in her purse and took out a small piece of fabric that she held under the dog's nose. He sniffed it deeply, then rushed over to the huge pile of debris and began hunting through the rubble. "What are you doing here?" Sabrina asked. "We're investigating a crime, naturally," Mrs. Grimm said. "Are you a police officer or something?" asked Daphne. "Or something," the old woman said with a grin. "Why don't you get out and look around?" She walked away, apparently to snoop through the rubble. Having a 200-pound dog lie on her lap had given Sabrina a Charlie horse, so she and Daphne decided to get out and stretch their legs. So a Charlie horse is something when your leg hurts because you've been sitting too long or something like that. She talks to the house and cows and has all these crazy rules. Now she thinks she's Sherlock Holmes, Sabrina muttered. "Maybe it's a game," Daphne said. "I'm going to be a detective too. I'm going to be Scooby-Doo." Despite all of Sabrina's warnings, Daphne seemed to be having fun, something she hadn't had in nearly a year and a half. It was nice to see her smile. It was the same look she used to have when their father would read to them the Sunday comics, or when their mother would let them invade her closet to play dress-up. Sabrina smiled and put her arm around the little girl's shoulders. She'd let her have fun. Who knew how long it would last? Just then, a long white limousine pulled into the clearing. It was bright and shining with white wall tires and a silver horse for a hood ornament. It parked next to Mrs. Grimm's car, and a little man got out of the driver's side. He couldn't have been more than 3 feet high. In fact, he was no taller than Daphne. He had a big nose and a pot belly that the buttons of his back suit struggled to contain. But the most unusual thing about that man wasn't his size or his clothing. It was the pointy paper hat he wore on his head that read, "I am an idiot." He rushed as quickly as he could to the other side of the car, opened the back passenger door, and was met with a bunch of insults from a man. "Mr. Seven, sometime today," the man bellowed in an English accent. "Do you think I want to sit in the muggy car all afternoon, waiting to find a time to open the door? You know, when you came to me for a job, I happily gave you one, but every day you make me regret it." A tall man in a purple suit exited the limousine and looked around. He had a strong jaw, deep blue eyes, and shiny black hair. He was probably the best-looking man that Sabrina had ever seen, and her heart began to race. That was until he opened his mouth. "What is this? Heads are going to roll, Mr. Seven." The man fumed as he looked around. "Yes, sir," Mr. Seven answered. "I was told that was taken care of last night. It's just lucky that I realized that everyone who works for me is an incompetent boob, or we would never have known this was still out here until it was too late. My goodness, look at this rubbish sitting over there in broad daylight. What do the 3 think I pay them for? I can't have this nonsense going on right now. Doesn't everyone realize that the ball is tomorrow? Heads are going to roll, Mr. Seven." So rubbish is garbage, and a ball is like a big party where people dance at. The little man nodded in agreement. His boss looked down at Sabrina, and Daphne scowled. What's that? That's like, "Look, the tourists are already here, and they're having their filthy children unsupervised. They are children, right, Mr. Seven? Not just a couple more of your kind?" Mr. Seven's dunce cap, that's the thing he's wearing, had slid down over his eyes. He lifted it and gazed at the two girls. They are children, sir. The way they are dressed, you would think that they are circus folk. You worked in the circus for some time, didn't you, Mr. Seven? The little man nodded. Where there ought to be a law about unsupervised children, there's a crime scene that's crawling with kids, Mr. Seven. It makes that a law if that isn't too much trouble, the man continued. No trouble at all, sir, said Mr. Seven as he took a spiral-bound pad and pen from his jacket pocket and furiously jotted it down, his boss's instructions. See how easy it is to be a team player, Mr. Seven? I like your change of attitude. If you keep this up, we might be able to get rid of that hat, the man said. That would please me, sir. Let's not rush things, Mr. Seven. After all, you still haven't given these children my card, which is incredibly frustrating, especially since we just discussed that last night. What did I tell you, man? Give everyone the card. It's good networking. Indeed it is, the man replied, tapping his toe impatiently. Okay, here's a picture. So it looks like this is the guy. We don't know who he is yet. The good-looking guy. There's Mr. Seven with his dunce cap. Daphne, Sabrina. Cool. Let's see what happens. So sorry, Mr. Charming, sir, Mr. Seven said as he rushed to the girls and shoved a business card in each of their hands. It was purple with a golden crown on one side and the words, Mayor William Charming, here to lead, written on it in gold lettering. Underneath the name were a telephone number and an email address and a website, www.mayorcharming.com. So who's Prince Charming? You guys know. What story is that from? Cinderella. Now, what was I saying before? I had to tell you how to do your job, Mr. Seven. But before the little man could answer, Sabrina stepped forward. If there was one thing she couldn't stand, it was a bully. You were saying there ought to be a law against unsupervised children, Sabrina said angrily. There should be a law against talking to people like they're morons, too. Yes, that's correct. See, Seven, if this carnival girl can pay attention to the conversation, why can't you? Why, she can't be more than 8 years old and certainly slow in the head, Mayor Charming said. I am almost 12, Sabrina shouted, and I'm not slow. Mayor Charming seemed to be startled by her anger. Where are your parents, child? He snapped. We're here with our grandmother, Daphne answered. Sabrina spun around on her sister angrily. The old lunatic was not their grandmother. So lunatic is like a crazy person. How splendid for you, Mayor Charming sneered. And who is your grandmother? Daphne pointed to Mrs. Grimm, who was busy taking notes on a little pad of paper. Relda Grimm is your grandmother? The mayor growled between gritted teeth. When will this cursed family die out? You're like a swarm of cockroaches. Mrs. Grimm looked over and saw Mayor Charming and quickly came to join them. Relda Grimm, I just met your granddaughters, the mayor said as his face changed from a scowl to a smile. They're the spitting image of their grandfather. He bent over and pinched Daphne on the cheek. Hopefully they'll grow out of it, he muttered. Mayor Charming, what brings you all the way out here? I thought you'd be busy planning the fundraiser. It's in a couple of days, correct? Said Mrs. Grimm with a forced smile. It's not a fundraiser, Charming insisted. It's a ball, and it is tomorrow night. You know how the community is. If I don't investigate every little stray cloud, the flock gets nervous. But then again, I could ask you the same question. What is the famous Relda Grimm doing in the middle of nowhere, looking at a broken house? He was right. It was a house that had fallen down. Sabrina saw pieces of furniture and clothing sticking out of the pile and an old Afghan quilt swinging from the stick in the breeze. I don't know the farmer expected with such shoddy workmanship. He's lucky to have crawled out alive, he continued. So there was a survivor, Mrs. Grimm said, writing in her notebook. Here she goes, Mr. Seven. You can almost see the wheels spinning in her head. Relda Grimm, private eye. How to solve the case that never was, the mayor said. See, that's the problem with you Grimms. You can never quite grasp that in order to solve a mystery, there must be a mystery to solve. A farmer built a flimsy house, and it fell down. It was an accident. Case closed. Then why did you call it a crime scene? Sabrina piped up. Charming turned and gave her a look that could have burned a hole through her. You must have misheard me, child, he said between gritted teeth. Mr. Seven, take down this note, please. New law! Children should not ask questions of their elders. As the little man scribbled furiously in his notebook, Mrs. Grimm said, We both know why you're here, Mayor. Charming's face turned red. He tugged on his necktie and adjusted his collar. This is none of your concern, Relda. Before the old woman could respond, Mr. Canis joined the group. Well, if it isn't the big, bad Mayor Charming, said Mrs. Grimm angrily. Oh, I'm sorry. I heard you were going by Canis now. Charming grinned and leaned in close to Sabrina and Daphne. Do yourselves a favor, girls, and check Granny's teeth before you give her a good-night kiss. Do you think it's wise to provoke me? Mr. Canis said as he took a step towards the mayor. Despite Mr. Canis's quiet demeanor, the words seemed to unnerve Charming. That's enough, Mrs. Grimm demanded. Her voice shook the girls, but the effect on the two grown men was even more startling. They backed away from each other like two schoolboys that had been scolded by a teacher. The dog has found something, Mr. Canis said. He placed an enormous green leaf in Mrs. Grimm's hand, and her eyes lit up with satisfaction. Okay, so we talk about something called foreshadowing. Now, foreshadowing is something that the author tells you to kind of give you a glimpse of what might be happening. So basically, we know these are fairy tale detectives, okay? And we have Prince Charming, who we know is a very popular fairy tale character. Now, he's made a comment where you need to check Granny's teeth at night. Now, I want you to think back to a story of what has a wolf in it. Not the Three Little Pigs, but Little Red Riding Hood, right? And what happens in the thing of Little Red Riding Hood? A big bad wolf pretends to be a grandmother. So that's a little bit of foreshadowing. So we kind of think that might be important later. Okay. Well, look at that, Mayor Charming. I think we found a clue. That might be a mystery to solve here yet, she said, waving the leaf in the mayor's angry face. Congratulations, you found a leaf in the middle of the trees. I bet if you could bring out the forensic team, you might find a twig or even an acorn. It looks a lot like a leaf from a beanstalk, the old woman replied. Charming rolled his eyes. That proves nothing. Maybe, maybe not, but it does seem odd that a fresh green leaf is out here in late November, Mrs. Grimm said. Sabrina looked around. Every tree limb was bare. Maybe, maybe not, but it does. Oh, listen, Relda, stop meddling in affairs, or you're going to regret it, said the mayor. If you don't want me meddling, then you must really do a better job of covering up your mistakes. Mrs. Grimm placed the leaf inside her handbag. The mayor scoffed and then turned to Mr. Seven. Get the door, you lumpy bag of foolishness, he shouted. The little man nearly lost his paper hat as he rushed to the car door. Within moments, the limo was spitting gravel behind it as he drove away. Girls, why don't you take a walk over there and sit by the tractor? I'd like to see this sight from above, Mrs. Grimm said. Daphne took the old woman's hand and helped her up a slope embankment, where a lonely tractor was parked. When they reached the top, the old woman plopped on the ground and caught her breath. Thank you, Liebling. Either the hills are getting steeper or I'm getting older. Who was that man? Daphne asked. Let's just say he's a royal pain, Mrs. Grimm replied. Mr. Charming is the mayor of Fairyport Landing. What's with the bad attitude? Sabrina said. The mayor reminded her of the orphanage's lunch lady, who seemed to delight in telling the children they were getting fat. He gets a little territorial sometimes. Territorial is like, this is my area, not your area type of thing. He and Mr. Canis don't like each other, Daphne added. They have a long history, the old woman said. She picked a small black disc off the ground. How interesting. She happily jotted down a note in her notebook, a lens cap from what looks like a very expensive video camera. Maybe it's just junk, Daphne said. Maybe. Or maybe whoever's responsible for all this damage wanted to record it. Mrs. Grimm tossed the lens cap into her handbag. Just then, a white van with the words Action 4 News painted on the side pulled up. The door swung open and a cameraman and a pretty reporter in a business suit jumped out. The reporter checked her hair in a compact mirror, and as the cameraman handed her a microphone, they eyed the pile of lumber. Hello, ladies, I'm William Fay from the Action 4 News, the reporter said as she shoved her microphone in Mrs. Grimm's face. We were wondering if you might be able to tell us what happened here. Oh dear, am I on television? The old woman asked. You will be, the reporter replied. Tell our audience what you witnessed. Oh, we didn't see anything, I'm afraid, said Miss Grimm. We only just got here. The reporter groaned, and the cameraman lowered his camera. Well, this is just great, Wilma Fay complained. 5 years of journalism school, graduating with honors, at the top of my class, and I'm out here in Ferryport Landing in the cold covering a house that collapsed. I'll get some shots of the damage, the cameraman said as he hoisted his heavy video camera back into the shoulder and walked down the hill to the rubble. Good idea, the reporter replied. Let's get out of here as soon as possible. Sorry I couldn't be of any help, said Mrs. Grimm. Oh, it's not your fault. I just keep getting sent out to do this town when there isn't any news. Yes, unfortunately, there's not a lot of excitement in Ferryport Landing, the old woman agreed. Wilma Fay nodded and headed back to the van. When the news crew had left, Mrs. Grimm removed the large green leaf and an odd little box covered in knobs and lights from her handbag. She placed the leaf on the ground, then pushed a red button on top of the box and waved it over the leaf. What are you doing? Daphne asked. I'm analyzing it. Very scientific stuff, the old woman said as the machine let out a loud honking sound that could only be described as a fart. Just as I thought, it's from a giant beanstalk. There's no such thing as beanstalks, Daphne giggled. Mrs. Grimm pointed at the clearing below. What do you see? A house that fell down, the little girl suggested. Yes, but what else? What is surrounding the house? Sabrina focused her attention on the rubble. What was unusual about it? Nothing, except for the large area of sunken ground that surrounded it. The earth is smashed around it, she said. And what could cause something like that? I don't know. What do you think? Sabrina said after running through the possibilities. I think a giant stepped on it. Mrs. Grimm answered, Find a giant beanstalk leaf and you'll find a giant. Daphne began to laugh, but Sabrina was horrified. The old woman was getting crazier and crazier. Daphne began, I'd better go down and have a second look, the old woman said as she climbed her feet. She walked back down the hill and joined Mr. Canis at the pile. She's funny, Daphne giggled. Funny in the head, Sabrina thought. I want to ride the tractor, Daphne cried. She jumped up and pulled her sister over to it. Sabrina lifted the little girl onto the seat and then grabbed the wheel and turned it, making a vroom vroom sound as she pretended to drive. Look at me, I'm a farmer, she said in a goofy voice. Sabrina looked up at her sister and laughed. Daphne was the funniest person that she ever had met. What kind of food do you grow on this farm here, Farmer Grimm? The older girl played along. Why, I grow candy on this farm, Daphne laughed. Bushels and bushels of candy. Just sent my crop to the market last week. Got me a pretty penny, I did. Sabrina smiled, but then a shadow covered her heart. Why did the old lady have to lie about who she was? Why did she have to make up crazy stories? Why couldn't she be normal? Her house was warm and comfortable, and as long as Sabrina kept an eye on Mr. Canis, they might just be okay. If the old woman wasn't a lunatic, she'd make a perfectly good grandmother. Sabrina, look at this house, Daphne whispered. She had stopped playing and was staring at the pile below. Sabrina looked at the clearing, but just saw nothing new. Do you see what I see? Daphne pointed. What do you see? Come up here. You have to see it from up here. Sabrina crawled up onto the tractor and stood high on its hood. Do you see it? And then Sabrina saw what her sister was so excited about, and her heart leaped into her throat. The indentation surrounding the broken down house had a shape. It's a footprint, she gasped. So do you guys remember in the very beginning, week 1, when we were reading, how they were running through the woods being chased by something? I wonder if that is going to come into play. Well, I don't know about you, but the story's got me hooked, and I can't wait to find out what happens next. Have a great week.